All right, we are ready to go for the 2020 edition of Prime Sports Hockey presents East Meets West. That is a new show that we're bringing to the network where we're going to sprinkle in some NHL talk and dive into team talk, specific team talk. Jan Levine's favorite team, the team that he also covers for a living, the New York Rangers, and my favorite team. I don't cover them for a living, but I sure have covered them personally for. I guess you got to go back. The earliest memory I have, Jan, of because remember the old days. How old are you?
I'm 52.
All right, so we're both. I'm 51, same age. So do you remember the old days? I remember listening to the Stanley Cup playoffs between the Islanders and Vancouver on my little tiny radio. Like I'd be out, like especially the late night ones in Vancouver, the Stanley Cup Finals. I'd be in bed. I'd have my little radio on, my little transistor radio, and I'd be listening to the Stanley Cup Finals on radio. It's just so long ago, man, when we were kids, and how we had to actually, especially hockey. You remember how hard it was to get hockey on television back in those days?
I remember. I mean, my earliest recollection, and I hate to date myself, was watching the 1972 Stanley Cup Finals between the Rangers and the Bruins.
That's a long time ago.
In my parents' bedroom because I was sick with a fever, and my grandparents were babysitting, and my grandmother and grandfather were both big Ranger fans, and they let me stay up. I was almost 5 to watch the 72 Stanley Cup Finals between the Rangers and the Bruins.
Wow. Now, television-wise, my earliest memory was the final between the Rangers and the Canadiens.
Really?
That was my earliest.
94?
Yeah, that was. No,
wow.
What? No. The
Rangers and Canadiens. Sorry, 79.
Yeah,
79.
that was John Davidson was the. Wasn't he playing for them at the time?
They beat the Islanders in 5 games to advance to the finals, and the Rangers won Game 1. Game 2, Bunny Larocque was supposed to start for the Canadiens. He got hit with a puck during warm-ups and got a concussion.
Wow.
And the Canadiens had to go back to Ken Dryden, who actually was in his last year of playing for the Canadiens, and he stoned the Rangers, and Steve Shutt had a monster next 4 games. JD had a bad knee, and it was all she wrote, and they lost 4-1 to the Canadiens that year.
There you go. Yeah, my dad worked in the city, and worked across the street from Manhattan, and the company that he had season tickets. So I went to a lot of Ranger games back in the Nick Fotiu, Ron Duguay era. So a lot of those, a lot of those bloody era of hockey.
They had the misfortune of being good at that point in time. At the same time, the Islanders were about to reel off their dynasty.
Yeah, that is true. So we have a lot to talk about as far as memory lane, and we'll do that in the coming months all the way through to the Stanley Cup Finals. We'll also talk about futures each week, and Jan, fresh off making $4,000 in our futures last year, picking the St. Louis Blues as one of his teams to win the championship. And, you know, I was looking at the odds for the Stanley Cup, and the Blues are not the favorite. They're almost the favorites, but to get, what are they, 10-1? To get 10-1 for the Blues right now, that's a pretty good proposition. That's they're looking awfully good right now again, and you know they're going to wind up adding more at the trade deadline.
I mean, the big name they have out right now is Vladimir Tarasenko, who's on long-term IR. And part of the equation is when they add him, because it impacts their cap. So if they don't add him back to the roster into the playoffs, they can go over. They can use his cap hit now to add another big body, which is something they may do come deadline.
What's his prognosis?
And then if he's already starting to skate.
Okay.
He's obviously had the shoulder surgery. The rumor was March originally. But if they can, somehow wait to add him until playoff time, and you put him, a healthy and really a refreshed Tarasenko from not playing, back in your lineup, and as you said, augment him with another skilled forward up front or a skilled defenseman, all of a sudden the moves that they made the last couple of years look even better because they have a very deep roster. We know what Craig Berube's done for them as a coach. We know what Jordan Binnington's done. Jake Allen is playing much better between the pipes this year. So they have a nice duo in net. So they're going to be a very interesting team. But we'll get into all the trade deadlines, because there is a substantive number of teams right now that are on the fringes that are not willing to deal yet. So over the next month or so until the trade deadline, which is February 24th, there'll be a lot of movement and migration of teams up and down the ladder as to whether or not they're contenders or pretenders right now.
Yeah, we'll have a deadline, a couple of deadline shows, especially a recap show, so we can go over all the the big deals and let you know exactly how the teams fared, or at least how it appeared that they fared, because you never know. Especially the deadline deal. I mean, St. Louis, what was their significant deadline deal last year? Did they have one?
Didn't really have a big one at that
Okay.
point. I'll have to go back and think. I mean, don't forget their big move clearly was one, bringing in Berube to replace Mike Yeo,
Yep.
and then B, turning the net in the beginning of January basically over to Binnington, as opposed to Jake Allen. And so those two moves had material impacts, and they were pretty much they were 30th out of 31 teams last year at that point in time.
Yeah,
So
right.
the movement they made up the ladder, they weren't big, they weren't doing big moves, but I mean they made their big moves in the offseason, really getting Ryan O'Reilly from Buffalo.
Okay.
And he played a significant component. And then you looked at Tarasenko. They had Robert Thomas, who they had drafted the year before. So they had little additions, not little, but additions that came aboard over the last couple of years that were augmented clearly by the coaching replacement, as well as also the replacement of Jake Allen with Binnington between the pipes.
And of course, we'll have a 32nd team coming up for the 2022 season.
Yeah. So Seattle is another year. So next year will be the expansion draft. And then they join the year for the 21-22 season.
21-22 season, and thank goodness because that's the one thing that is also a pain in the neck for the 31 teams that have to protect certain players on their roster, especially when a lot of these teams are up against the cap. That's another thing. I mean, you get the feeling that I don't know. I don't know if it's the whole fiscal policy of how they come up with the cap figures and all that other stuff. That's far. I don't have time to figure that stuff out. But it is interesting that a lot of teams are up against it, especially a lot of the contenders. But I'm also glad to see and to hear that it's becoming now. I think we're at that era, that breaking point, where teams are no longer going to be giving these outrageous contracts to these players anymore. They understand it's just ridiculous. You can't give 8-year, X million-dollar contracts out to players anymore. I think that's going to be so rare if you're ever going to see that happen. And that's a good thing, because it's just, especially for teams like my team, Vancouver, who does well in drafting. You know, you don't want to see your teams do well in drafting, sort of like in the NFL with Seattle. People want to know what happened to that dynasty. Well, you want to know what happened to the Seattle Seahawks dynasty? Free agency. You know, everybody took their players. So you would hope that in time they'll figure out a way that if you draft well, you'll be able to keep your players home.
Well, I mean, it's first of all, in the NFL, that's you know, the players have a right after being under the quote unquote finger of the team, because you know what the rookie level contracts are. They have 4 or 5 years of control before they have an opportunity to make a lot of money. You know, you look what Russell Wilson made the first couple of years that he was under contract. He was probably grossly underpaid and made up for it on the back end. That's just the way the NFL works. The same thing in the NHL. You have the ELCs, the entry-level contracts with their 3-year deals. A lot of times they'll be augmented by performance bonuses, and depending on if they meet those bonuses. And then the big thing is, once you're about to hit year 3, they no longer have those while they have bridge deals, they no longer have effective bridge deals based upon the way the contracts work. And you know, you talk about your team with the Canucks, right? If Quinn Hughes in about 2 more years is up for free agency, don't be shocked if Vancouver looks to lock him up long term.
Oh, they'll be doing that next offseason.
Right.
That's how. Yeah, they're going to be making sure before they get to that
exactly.
point.
So
yeah.
Your comment about you will still see 8-year deals, because teams can re-sign their own free agents to 8-year deals. You'll still see the elite players. I mean, look what Artemi Panarin got from the Rangers, 7 years, $11.6 million. Now, granted, the last couple of years of that contract, it may be a waste of a contract. But if you look at what he's done so far and the performance he's given them, you can almost argue that the $11.6 million is a bargain based upon the production that you've seen from him. You know, look at what Draisaitl's making. You look at what McDavid's making. Those are guys who are living up to their contract. The question is identifying which player is the right player that you need to be able to sign and sign for a long-term deal.
Yeah, GMs, and we talked about it with the Jets, GMs have got to be smart, and they have to sign these guys a year early. You sign them a year early, you get them at a discount, and like you said, then if you're going to sign a Pettersson and a Hughes in one offseason to 8-year deals, you know you're going to wind up saving an awful lot of money. Let's just say an opposing team had an opportunity to take a Hughes or a Pettersson away from you. Well, they're going to have to pay through their intestines compared to what, say, the Vancouver Canucks would be able to afford these players by signing them to the same type of tenure just a year earlier.
Agreed. It's a matter of managing and maximizing your assets. And Vancouver has, you look at Besser, you look at Horvat, and you're talking about Pedersen, and you're talking about Hughes. Those are two guys that are I want to know. I don't. You can probably call both of them the face of your franchise for as good as Horvat, and he's the captain,
Mm-hmm.
and Besser is. Pedersen and Hughes are the two guys you're going to build around for the future. Those are guys that are likely going to get maximum extensions, and have to figure out how to build around them and hope the cap rises accordingly, and hope that your team can hopefully supplement them with players on ELCs and cheaper contracts to a certain extent to build around them. You talked about, in goaltend, you have Markstrom, right? So, but Markstrom is the guy for now. Thatcher Demko may be the guy for the future. You have to figure out how you're going to sign these guys. Do you go bridge or do you go long term? If you go bridge now, you may be making it up for it on the back end when the salary cap rises and you're paying them even more down the road.
Well, Markstrom is going to, if he decides that he'll give Vancouver a discount and he's not going to ask for what he'll probably get from another team when free agency opens up, then he stays in Vancouver. If he winds up looking for a 6-year deal, which is possible, he won't be playing in Vancouver. He'll be somewhere else, and Vancouver will have to go with Plan B, which is Demko. They'll have to go, okay, we're going to have to now stunt the progress of our team by going to Demko and taking our lumps as he grows into a goalie over the next couple of years. It's not where they want to go, but if Markstrom does that and decides not to give him a discount, Vancouver can't afford it. They just can't. You can't afford to give a guy like Markstrom 6 years when you got Demko, who's about a year away from taking over the full-time job. So what happens then if they sign Markstrom to 4 or 5 years and he gives him a discount, then you got to trade Demko, and he becomes one of your top trade chips. So
right, and then we talked about maximizing assets. That's kind of what the GM has to figure out. What it's going to cost for Hughes, what's going to cost for Pedersen, what's coming up in the system. If you move Markstrom, you don't re-sign Markstrom and you sign Demko, is he the guy that you think can carry you moving forward? Can you get him on a cheaper deal than you will Markstrom, which is most likely to be the case? And then how do you build around those guys in order to make sure you have the type of team that potentially can contend for the cup in the future?
How are the Rangers doing as far as their salary cap situation? You take a look, of course, you mentioned Panarin, so he's taking up a good chunk. So and Kreider is going to be the big name at the trade deadline, isn't he?
Correct. I mean so it's interesting there. Lundqvist with $8.5 million is utilizing a lot of the cap, but he's only got one more year left, and they have Alexander Georgiev, and you also have Igor Shesterkin, who they just called up, who's their goalie of the future probably. So Georgiev is drawing potentially a lot of trade interest. I mean, a name like Toronto has come up a lot because Toronto's looking for a backup goalie. I know some people have proposed San Jose because Martin Jones has not played well this year or the last 2 years. You look at Aaron Dell, who's been up and down. They may be looking for a goalie of the future. The Kreider is the big name because of the fact of what he's going to want in free agency. You could get 5-6 years at close to $7 million per. That's a key factor. The point is, if New York can find a way to move, let's say, a Mark Stahl, who's making $5.7 million next year, it has 1 year left on his deal, or maybe, let's say, a Brendan Smith, who's over $4 million left, then they can free up room. But they also have to figure out a way to sign Tony DeAngelo long term if they're going to keep him, who's having a monster season and was only signed a 1 year deal last year because he didn't have arb rights, and they also were under a cap constraint last year to try to figure out a way to get him under contract. But you have guys like Jesper Fast, who's going to be an unrestricted free agent, who's going to draw some interest. So the Rangers are not in a bad position cap-wise, but it's going to take some massaging and Jeff Gordon figuring a way to be strategic to try to create additional cap room in order to potentially sign some of these guys, given the pipeline of lots of young defensemen that are there, Shesterkin being your goalie of the future, figuring a way if you're going to find a way to keep a 3-goalie system because of the fact you also have Lundqvist still under contract for 1 more year, and you have Georgiev there who's going to be arbitration eligible and likely move from $900,000 probably closer to $2 to $3 million this year, maybe a little more. So Gordon and GM John Davidson are going to have the work cut out for him to try to figure out who they keep and who they don't, and whether or not do they keep Kreider at the trade deadline? Do they move him? Do they try to get some assets for him now? Is he a guy you look to resign? So there's definitely lots of questions that exist for the Rangers, but the upside potential they have based upon the pipeline, especially on the blue line, is pretty strong. Vitaly Kravtsov is there, who's the guy they drafted this past year. 2 years ago, Capo Caco, who's a rookie this year. You look at Carl Henriksen, who's a second, who was drafted this past year, who could pan out to be your center. And the other name to keep an eye on is Ryan Strome, who's blossomed playing with Panarin, who's also going to be a restricted free agent with arb rights, do the Rangers try to move him, or are they willing to sign him for a couple of years because he's looking at a raise of probably close to $4 million or maybe more than that based upon what he's making now.
So where are the Rangers right now, being in the New York market? Where are they as far as what's the philosophy? Is it we're going to build this team, even though we're in a big market, we're going to be patient, we're going to build through the draft, we're going to be conscious with the cap, etc., or are they going to try and be a cup contender by next year?
I think the goal right now is to be cautiously patient. And what I mean by that, and I hate using the caveat, but 2 years ago they came out with a letter for the rebuild. They moved assets 2 years ago. They moved assets last year. They got lucky enough to move up to the number 2 pick and get Kakko, who's believed to be a type of talent that can be an elite scorer down the road, though he struggled this year a bit as a rookie. They've augmented it by making other deals in order to try to add in talent associated around. They made the Ryan Strome deal for Ryan Spooner, which has proven to be a beneficial deal. They added Panarin, which is an example of their willingness to spend money for an elite free agent. You look at their blue line, where if you can move Stahl and Smith, and you look at the pipeline, they added Jacob Trouba. So they made moves to improve themselves in the short term with also a long-term outlook. So I'd say the viewpoint now is they're not going to go throw money out the door and throw money at everything, but they are going to try to augment the talent. The viewpoint, Spolsky, is they don't want to just add draft picks this year because they have a lot of draft picks and have used them already, but they want to add young forwards who are ready to be top 9 guys that are potential top 6 guys in the future to build around the core that they have, which includes Mika Zibanejad and Panarin, which we mentioned already.
All right, 3 quick things before we move on to the NHL, and that is Lundqvist. How many more years?
1 more year after this year on his contract, and then he will be a unrestricted free agent. He signed a 7-year, $8.5 million AAV contract, obviously almost 6 years ago. So he's got 1 more year after this season.
Will he retire next year?
He's got a no movement clause, so they can't move him without his permission. They asked him last year if he wanted to stay as part of the rebuild 2 years ago. He was willing. There's rumors that they could potentially approach him again, though the speculation is he most likely will not be willing, though the name of Colorado as a potential team of interest is one that's come up a lot lately, though nothing tying him directly to him. I would say the odds of him retiring are probably less than 50-50 unless he continues to struggle and he sees the writing on the wall and he wants to go out on a high as opposed to just basically carrying on for another year in a system where he may be the second or third goalie. Sure. Based upon if they move Georgiev and what they do with Shesterkin.
So could he be traded with his permission next month?
He could be traded, but you're going to have to find a team that's got a lot of cap room, okay. Or B, the Rangers would have to be willing to eat potentially up to 50% of the contract to facilitate a move.
All right. And what about Quinn? So far, how has he been doing?
I personally like Quinn. He's held guys accountable. The big question that's come up is the system that he's utilized defensively. It's something he used in college. It's something that he and Lindy Ruff have been the two guys who's the coach of the defense have implemented. The defense, while there's been a ton of offense from the blue line this year, defensively they still struggled in their own zone. And it's not just the defense, but it's also the forwards. It's the 2 guys chasing a guy behind the net. It's the system of backing off at the blue line at times and ceding space, which has created opportunities. It's the new mantra of letting the guy in front of the goalie and kind of trying to block out in front of him. So the struggles that we saw last year defensively and 2 years ago with the Rangers when Alain Vigneault was still the coach, they still continue to haunt them in their own zone, which has resulted in way too many good scoring chances or high danger scoring chances against, which puts a lot more pressure on the goalies than needs to be.
Okay, now the All-Star game. Actually, one other thing, and that's Kreider, that I asked you a little bit about before. Just give me yes, no. Does he get traded?
I'm going to go with no, but that's a very 51-49 no. It all depends. The Rangers have 2 weeks now where they play 7 teams that they could potentially beat, including Detroit twice, and they have 4 home games, which none of them will be easy. They also have, I think it is 35 games, and then I think it's 30 games in the next 64 days. So it's almost one every other day with a lot of back-to-backs and a heavy-duty schedule. So if they're going to make a move, they'll have to do it now, or Part of it's going to be there hasn't been negotiations yet between Kreider and his agent and the Rangers. If that doesn't change quickly and they don't get a sense for where he is, the historically we've seen with Kevin Hayes and Matt Zuccarello, they'll carry him until like the last week before the deadline and then move him right before the deadline.
Okay, the All-Star game. What did you think about it? They're going to change back to the competition against international players, so I like that. What do you think about what you saw and what we're going to see next year?
I mean, I think the best part of the All-Star game was probably the 3-on-3 between the U.S. women and the Canadian women was probably the best part of it. And the skills competition, the game in itself, I watched bits of it, but there's no defense played. There's never any defense played, and the 3-on-3 is not really a game. It's more of an exhibition.
Well, wouldn't you rather, but in that circumstance, because I don't like most All-Star games anyway, but wouldn't you rather see the 3-on-3 than the 5-on-5 with no defense?
It's pick your poison. I don't like either one of them, to be honest with you. And I understand that's kind of how the game has gone now, but this year was kind of embarrassing to just watch it. Look, there's a lot of skill, but it's part of my language. It's a bastardized kind of version of the NHL, and I know that they use it in overtimes, and I know they try to do it to spur interest. So yes, there is a lot of goal scoring and a lot of fun, but when guys are going breakaway after breakaway after breakaway on the goalies, it's not real true hockey. So it's fun to watch the skill of them, and it's fun to watch the offensive guys can generate as much scoring opportunities as they want. But it's not what I would call a fun game necessarily to watch, and it's not the greatest exhibition for the sport.
And how in the world did Thomas Hertl not win the MVP?
It's a great question, because after watching that game, or whatever you can call it a game, I really thought that Hertl was the guy. Pasternak had a great one, but you would expect the guy that put up a hat trick in one game and scored kind of quote unquote the game winner.
The game winner. The other guy had an empty net goal. So come on. I mean, Hertl. I was shocked that Hertl didn't win it. Come on.
I agree.
All right. Anyway, so let's open up with the East and talk. Actually, yeah. Let's just quickly talk about that first. And any surprises? Would Tampa Bay be the biggest surprise? The fact that they're 8 points back of Boston.
They were very poor beginning of the season. So Andrei Vasilevsky wasn't playing particularly well. Nikita Kucherov was not having the kind of season. Braden Point was coming back from an injury. Victor Hedman was banged up. But if you look at their record lately and what they've done recently, you can say the same thing about Florida. Right? They acquired Sergei Bobrovsky this offseason, supposed to solidify them between the pipes. Alexander Barkov got off to a mildly slow start for him. Even though you had Jonathan Huberdeau putting up big points, and you had great play out of Ekblad and especially Keith Yandel, the big issue was between the pipes. Bobrovsky started to play well. All of a sudden, Tampa and Florida are now starting to move their way up the standings. They're both of my teams to reckon with. They're both, in my opinion, teams that could challenge Boston, even though Tuukka Rask is coming back from his concussion. If Rask and Yaroslav Halak don't play well between the pipes, and Boston goes on even a mild losing streak, I don't see Tampa or Florida slowing down much. So that's going to be an interesting battle, even though they're 8 points back with 3 months to go in the regular season. 8 points is kind of nothing at this point in time, given the talent that exists on Tampa Bay.
Well, after what happened last year, though, this shouldn't be a surprise. This is like what happened, almost like kind of what happened to Washington those years. Where psychologically you realize, well, what the hell does it matter if we just destroy ourselves with we think these meaningful games in the regular season when they're not. We can win no matter who you match us up against in the playoffs. So I kind of feel that that's where Tampa Bay is that once they started realizing, okay, you know what, I think we have to start playing better, they started playing better. And they're still, they're still one of the co-favorites, I believe, right, to win the Stanley Cup as well they should be?
They should be. I mean, look, Tampa Bay is a talented team. I still think they need some help on the blue line. But offensively, you look at the talent they can roll out there. And as I've written a couple times, you don't even really focus on Steven Stamkos anymore because of all the talent around him. But you just realize how good he is, and the fact that he may not be the number one option is a fairly scary thought for teams that have to face them. But they're going to have to face the demons when they make the playoffs of we were the number one seed and got bounced by the 8th seed last year, and can we rebound after that performance?
All right, and then in the West, what would be the biggest surprise there? Would it be all the parity, especially in the Pacific Division, where you have 5 teams separated by 1 point, and Nashville's 7 points out, but they've got actually, if you look at the wild card, they're 6 points behind Arizona, Vegas for the wild card, and they have 5 games in hand on Vegas and 4 in Arizona. So Nashville, even though they fired their coach, which we'll be getting into on next week's show, they're very much in it as well, based on the fact that they've got those games in hand.
5 games in hand is a huge amount of games, especially when you're implementing a new system and your viewpoint is your coach is a bit more, I would say, defensive minded, which has helped that organization given what surrounds them from a defensive perspective in front of Pekka Rinne and Juuse Saros. To me, probably the bigger surprise is probably the firing Gerard Gallant and the issues that they've had in Vegas. Though part of that probably can be attributed to the uneven play by Marc-Andre Fleury this year. To me, that's probably a little bit more of a surprise of what we've seen. As Gallant being the guy who was carried them to the Cup Finals 2 years ago, had a very good season again last year. Now this year, you had a 4-6 stretch, and all of a sudden you find that they've hired a new coach. So that's probably the bigger surprise, coupled, as we'll talk about next week, all the other coaching changes that has existed in the league within the first 2-3 months of the season, probably more so than we've seen in the past several seasons overall.
Yeah, next week we're going to go in depth on all the firings. I'll get your opinion on the coaches who have taken over. A couple of coaches who were fired or actually have taken over on a couple of those jobs. So we'll get into that. We'll get into the big racial situation that started the whole process, really, with Bill Peters in Calgary. And then, of course, we'll continue our talk with the Rangers in Vancouver. And look, this was strictly a coincidence that we started this show with Vancouver in first place. So
coincidence.
Yeah, just because they could be in second. They could be outside the wild card by next week when we do the show.
Could be.
They could be. Yes, they play the Blues tonight, by the way, in St. Louis.
It's a fun matchup.
Yeah,
fun matchup.
Not for me. Maybe they'll get their second game on NBC this year. This anti-Canadian thing that we've talked about before, especially now this year with a lot of these Canadian teams playing better. I mean, when you have Draisaitl, McDavid on Edmonton, you've got Pettersson, you've got Hughes on Vancouver. You've got to start playing these teams on that network more often.
I agree. I mean, we've talked about as far, if you're going to build the game, you got to put other teams on. You can't just always centralize on a handful of teams. But as we know, it's also ratings driven, so that plays a big factor in terms of who you see all the time.
Who's watching Detroit?
I don't
know.
It's
an embarrassment. If I'm a Detroit fan, I wouldn't even watch them.
I'm surprised they haven't just flexed those out to other games yet. It's a bit surprising to me that they haven't done that like the NFL does.
Yeah, I can imagine you saying, okay, we've got to set everything up for traveling, 2 weeks in advance? Do you really need to have traveling much more
Probably
than
not.
that? I wouldn't think so. So let's hope the second half is a lot better as far as broadcasting, the ability to see more of these Canadian teams and other teams as well that we'll get into next week, like Columbus and Carolina, who have maybe surprised people that they're still hanging out in the wild card race in the Eastern Conference, especially Columbus after who they lost. So great job by Tortorella, right? He's had maybe his best season.
Great job, phenomenal job, given all the changes that have existed there and he's showing again just how good of a coach he can be.
And we're also going to post our initial futures plays up on the website of Prime Sports Network, so we'll have that posted later today. I'll get them from you off the air. And before I let you go, Rangers talk. Where can we check you out as far as that besides Twitter?
HockeyBuzz, hockeybuzz.com. I'm the Rangers beat writer, so pretty much at a minimum a blog almost every day, depending on what's going on. Right now, I've started with the break because they're off to January 31st. My view of kind of the state of the franchise, breaking it down by position. I've done forwards and defensemen. Goalies hopefully coming up tomorrow if I can get the blog up. Just kind of looking at breaking it down between who definitely stays, who definitely goes, and who's in that middle ground of might stay or might go, partly depending on what happens with the record and what happens with the other teams around them.
Jan, appreciate it. Good to talk hockey again. We'll do it again next week.
Looking forward to it.